What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? Story number 1. I had a heart attack at 25 years old on New Year's Eve while I was at home on my own. Wasn't really feeling well during the day, a bit like a flu, so I cancelled my plans, and about 10 p.m. I started sweating uncontrollably, and within half an hour had this indescribable pain in my chest. Between the panic and the pain I couldn't really do much. I absolutely thought I was going to die on my own on Hawaii. I somehow managed to dial 000, and for a final joke to the situation, I went into cardiac arrest at exactly midnight. Extra. The cause was Takotsubo syndrome, an interesting and not well understood thing. The trigger for the TTS was never really found, but they believe it was an infection of some sort. Second story. When I was 7, I was playing in my grandpa's front yard. A random car pulled up beside me and a young lady with an older man pulled out a rabbit in a cage and she said, "Hey, you want to pet my cute rabbit?" Being the foolish and naive youth that I approached the car and I was within an arm's reach of the lady when my grandma came running out screaming at me. I don't remember what she said, but I had never heard anything like that before. The car then sped off and my grandma ripped me from the pavement and took me inside. I'm so grateful she was there, and I always think about how different my life would be had she have been a couple seconds later. Story number 3. A robber got into my house when I was about 8. Luckily, my dog noticed and bit the guy's leg and wouldn't let go. My dad heard the commotion, ran downstairs to see the robber trying to go back over the fence, with my dog still attached to their leg. My dad had to pull my dog off this guy's leg because she wouldn't let go. Police were called, but the guy was long gone. Doggy is still alive to this day. Fourth story. Riding a bike home from Walmart, getting hit by a truck, flying into a rock which fractured my skull and knocked out a piece of it, which apparently saved my life cause my brain was swelling a lot. Story number 5. Knocked over a propane tank in the garage, cracked the neck and it started off gassing. It was between me and the door into the house. Garage door was closed. Cleared the door about a half second before it ignited from the gas water heater's pilot light. Lost all the hair on my face and got a burn on the hand I used to pull myself through the door. House was a total loss, but we all got out okay. Next story. The scariest thing that happens to me was probably getting robbed at gunpoint, but the most scared I've ever been was when one of my kids at the summer camp I worked at had a seizure while crossing the street, and hit their head on the curb while they fell. Waiting for the paramedics to show up, and totally unable to help the unconscious child that I was responsible for, I felt way more helpless than I did while handing my phone and wallet over to the a-hole who pulled a gun on me. Next story. Losing 3 liters of blood. I was on the way to the hospital for a routine checkup when I was 33 weeks pregnant. Wasn't feeling too well, so left a bit earlier. At the lights I suddenly gushed out all this blood. It was like a bucket pouring out blood. Husband ran the red light and got us to hospital. Baby's heart rate was very low and within 20 minutes they got her out via emergency C-section. She survived and they told me I had a total placenta abruption. Had we been at home we would have both died. I had such an adrenaline rush that it took me days to actually realize how close to death we were. That was a year ago. And my daughter is doing well. Next story. The scariest thing that ever happened to me was only scary when I thought about it later. Recently, in a town over from us, a young man was reported as a missing person. He had just vanished from his residence 2 weeks prior to when he was reported missing. About a month later, they found his body, half a block from our house. They had found his body under a blue tarp. I walk pretty frequently in our neighborhood, and I walked past that tarp multiple times. Authorities say that the body was placed there, and I don't know what is scarier, knowing that a man's body was half a block away from where I was sleeping, or that his murderer was. Story number 9. Nearly had a giant tree limb fall on me whilst doing my water meter rounds. Heard an ear-splitting crack above me, looked up, yelled a rather elongated freak, and jumped backwards just in time. At a minimum, I would have been knocked out. Let's get to the next story. Was walking on the sidewalk near a freeway overpass when I heard an enormous crash. A man, a 15-foot piece of guardrail, an AV8 motor came flying down from the freeway. I literally jumped out of the way as it landed on the spot I was just walking on. The guardrail made a huge gash in the sidewalk. I would have been squashed. The man was twisted in every direction. His body was ripped apart. Apparently, he hit the guardrail in his car with such force the motor was ripped from the motor mounts, and he flew through the windshield. It was right across from a fire station, but the guy was dead. I just walked away, but it's always been a terrible memory. Let's get to the next story. When my daughter was 14, she attempted, by taking a whole bottle of Benadryl pills. In the 20 minutes it took me to get her to the ER, she couldn't walk or talk anymore. The nurse was trying to get her to drink some liquid charcoal, but she wouldn't listen to the nurse. I took the cup and was coaxing her into taking some. She took 2 sips, looked at me, grabbed my hand, then her eyes rolled into the back of her head, and she started having a seizure. I screamed for help and the room flooded with nurses and doctors. I was told to wait outside while they worked on her. They put her into a coma and cut off her clothes. She seized for 3 to 4 hours despite being given meds to stop them. She spent a week in the hospital before being sent to a psych hospital for 2 weeks. She's over 18 now and doing great. Seeing her face when she started seizing and then seeing her in a coma is something I can't get out of my head. Let's get to the next story. A man stalked me until he got my morning routine down. I would wake up at 5, see my spouse off, work out in detached garage-type room for 2 or 3 hours, take our dog to the park, then work in the garden or house until my spouse came home in the afternoon. That morning, my husband decided he wasn't going to work. He woke up before me and left me in bed to sleep in. When he let the dog out, he noticed the door to my workout room was open ajar, but didn't notice anything else wrong, so he closed it, called the dog and came back inside to play video games. The guy had been waiting for me in my workout room. He had heard someone come out, so he checked the back door, and it was unlocked. He came into the house with his shoes off and his pants and belt undone, and had taken one of my knives from the kitchen drawer. When he rounded the corner to the living room, my husband and dog were there between him and me, sleeping nude with the door open in the bedroom. They were taken totally off guard. The dog went into murder mode and my husband grabbed him and opened the door to get the guy outside and call the cops. Everything happened so quickly, it could have all gone down so differently. This happened 8 years ago, but I've thought about it a lot recently with the U of I murder stuff, and it gets to me. What if my husband hadn't randomly decided to stay home that morning? Story number 13. A few months ago, I had been at work for 2 hours when I got a call from the babysitter. She was watching my 3-year-old and 6-month-old. Her entire statement as soon as I answered, 3-month-old's not breathing. I talked back and forth and found that he was unresponsive and not breathing. Ultimately, I took off at a high rate of speed down the interstate and made it to the sitter as my wife and her boss were about to head to the hospital and follow the ambulance. I jumped in. We made it to the hospital while praying and holding hands the entire time. When we got there, they took my wife and I back as they continued to do CPR and pump more meds into him. After we saw him and sobbed, they took us to a nearby room where my wife and I talked with a doctor. He told us they'd been doing CPR for 45 minutes. We knew the science. In the middle of that convo, a nurse ran in to tell us that he had just developed an erratic and inconsistent 20 BPM heartbeat. At this time, we knew that what would come back had no chance of survival and would be misery for him. We told them to stop. It was the hardest, scariest, and most soul-crushing 30 minutes of my life. It was ultimately deemed to be SIDS and that there was not a single thing they could find that caused it. He was perfectly healthy and the happiest baby I've ever seen. We miss you, buddy. We hope your organs went on to help some other poor souls in a similar situation. Story number 14. My oldest daughter didn't come home from school one day. She was supposed to take the bus home to her dad's house. He called me frantic around 6 p.m. asking if she was with me. I was at work, and the panic began. Police were called. They began looking all the while my younger daughter was searching online comments for clues, and she found her sister. After several hours and what police had gathered, they weren't looking for a living 15 years old. When my younger daughter, 13 at the time, realized where her sister was, EMS was sent and cops busted into the home, terrifying a set of unsuspecting parents. I wasn't kept updated. It was chaos and I didn't know my daughter was found. What they found was my daughter and another classmate overdosed in the bedroom. Both were rushed to hospital. They were found after my younger daughter followed a trail of comments online that indicated the two were planning to end their lives. My daughter coded once and the friend was comatose for a few days. Both were committed to different psychiatric facilities once they were cleared medically. It was horrible and I can't begin to describe the terror of those days and those first hours or I will spiral into full-blown panic. It has been years, but there has never been anything in my life to even touch the physical illness-inducing terror of first not knowing where she was or what had happened, then the months of never letting her out of my sight. Therapy and meds and support happened, but it has been a very long road. She is better now, but that worry is always there. Next story. I was cliff jumping and I slipped on wet rock and started to slide down toward the edge. As I was going off the edge, I pushed off with my hands as hard as I could and was able to clear the rocks below and land in the water. Let's get to the next story. Day after Christmas, 1998.9 was 9 and in the car with my mom, who was 36, and my cousin, who was almost 14. We were traveling out of state, about 10 hours, to visit my mother's parents and siblings, including my cousin's mother. His mom and dad were divorced and lived near us with his dad at the time. I got tired, told my mom I was going to take a nap, said I love you to both and immediately fell asleep. Some undetermined amount of time later, I woke up and heard just noise. People, vehicles, sirens. Looking around, I couldn't tell what had happened. I was covered in blood. That wasn't mine. I began to panic, and someone in white, It's all I can remember, and I assume it was a paramedic, came to me and told me to stay calm, I would be okay. I was life flighted out shortly after. We'd hit a tractor trailer parked on the side of the road. He had no signals out. It was kinda foggy. I was told he had, in his system too. By the time my mom must have realized he was there, it was too late, and the brakes gave out. 6 months later there was a recall on that car for that exact thing. I won't go into gory details, but suffice it to say my mother had a closed casket. My cousin died of internal bleeding. I almost died, but the doctor said the only thing that saved me was I was asleep. So I was relaxed enough when we hit, and while the internal damage I suffered was life-threatening, but was close enough to medical help that I survived. I can't think of a time I was more scared than in the back of that Lincoln Town car. Somehow my young mind shielded me from the horror of what had happened to my mother, because I should have seen her. Doctors believe it's a trauma response, and I blocked it. I have zero interest in unblocking that. Whoever that paramedic was, thank you. You were there to calm me down when all I knew was terror. I think you're a big reason I'm still here today. I'm sure what you witnessed haunts you, but that little girl you calmed down is beyond grateful. Next story. When I was a kid, I was mucking about with a friend of mine. We were stood on an old disused railway bridge which had one hell of a drop to the road below. We should not have been up there as there were no railings. But kids will be kids. My friend decided to scare me by pushing me, and then grabbing my coat, pulling me back. But for that second, my center of gravity was over and I was going to fall had he not pulled on me. For that split second I knew I was going to die. Story number 18. Once, my parents were arguing on the car, while me and my little brother were on the back seats. In the middle of the discussion, my father threatened to throw the car in front of a moving truck, so we could all die together. I can still hear my mother crying, my brother screaming, and me praying. Let's get to the next story. Started coughing up blood after having a cigarette a while back. A lot of blood. I've smoked for 20 years. I was in denial for a day and refused to see a doctor. Finally went to the ER and got a skin done. I was already starting to think how to get my affairs in order. It turned out to be pneumonia. I quit smoking on the spot, scared straight. Next story. A friend of mine was drinking and decided to pull out a revolver while we were sitting around talking. Unloaded the gun, but in a drunk stupor decided to replace one bullet and play Russian roulette. While trying to take the gun from him, he points it toward the ground and says it's not loaded and pulls the trigger, hitting me in my left leg. Blood was everywhere, but luckily we was only 1 block from the hospital and I immediately rushed out and flew straight there. They believed I was going to lose from the knee down, but after a second opinion and a transfer to a better hospital there was minimal damage after surgery and a couple months recovering. I retained 100% use of my leg. Thank the Lord above. Never talked or hung out with him again. Never hang out with drunk idiots or idiots in general. Stupidity and guns don't mix. Let's get to the next story. When I realized I was on my own completely, my family sued me after my grandmother passed and left me the bulk of her will. I was across the country for college and I was in a bad motorcycle accident and couldn't walk. I had no support system, was only 21 and alone from multiple surgeries. I was still in a lawsuit with the family, then in a lawsuit for the accident, and trying to graduate college. It felt like diving into an abyss without a parachute, but it was a tunnel of never-ending darkness because it was the rest of my sudden adulthood without the help of people I thought I could count on. Next story. My appendix was about to burst when I was 8, but I didn't feel anything until I woke up early one day feeling a little sick in the stomach. Slowly over the course of the morning it built up into the most unbearable pain. My mom thought it wasn't as bad as I was making it out to be and took me to the doctor after dropping my siblings off at school, and the doc said to take me to the ER immediately. I was in so much pain and was trying to stay curled up in the fetal position. I think there were 2 or 3 nurses holding me down and trying to get N4 into my arms, but struggling to find the vein. While I felt like stomach was burning and about to burst, I kept feeling needles jabbing the inside of my elbow to the point where I was begging them to stop because the constant stabbing feeling was almost as unbearable as the appendix. I still remember this poor nurse tried to make jokes and get me to engage with him like he was trying to get me to relax. But I was in so much pain I couldn't function properly. At some point they finally get a vein after what felt like forever. I get rushed into surgery and the surgery goes from an expected few hours to almost 10 because my appendix burst while they were operating, amongst other complications, and they had to clean up all the filth. They said if I was 30 minutes later then it would have been a different conversation, which still kinda freaks me out. What would have happened if it burst while I was conscious? Never wanted to find out, and just hoped the doctor was being dramatic. The hospital stay was even worse than the lead up because I would be there on my own at night, and for the first 2 or 3 nights I would be waking up suddenly in a bed full of crap, or having vomiting all over myself, while also having this giant red-looking 6-inch long scar covered in sickly yellow solid holding gel. The look of disgust on one nurse's face is permanently etched into my mind, But all I remember is sobbing and apologizing and being terrified that I would go to sleep again just to wake up in my own filth all over again and have someone upset with me. Plenty more happened to contribute to the scary experience, but that's the gist of it. Let's get to the next story. When I was about 13, I was walking home from the gas station. I always took backways alleys. At some point I realized that I kept seeing the same vehicle off in the distance behind me, even though I was kind of zigzagging around. It was enough that I was on alert. I panicked and took a sharp turn and hid behind a dumpster. I could see them coming down, driving slowly as they had been the whole time, and then I saw some brake lights and one man got out. I just remember sprinting full force and very much on the main road all the way home and locking the door, and just being filled with fear because I also knew both parents weren't home. I always tried to reason with myself that it was a coincidence, but I'm not so sure it was, and I'd have bad dreams about it for a very long time afterwards. I also never took backways ever again, and it took me almost a year to feel safe walking anywhere alone again. Story number 24. Carbon monoxide poisoning while house sitting for a friend. I thought I was just coming down with something. Headache, very tired and weak, until I passed out in the kitchen, and my then boyfriend decided to look up my symptoms. Apparently he also wasn't feeling well. Long story short, we called the gas company to come out and check. I don't remember the exact reading, but the guy tells us the level it's at. He shouldn't even be going into the house. He then urged us to go to the hospital. It took over a year for me to feel normal again. Let's get to the next story. Not something that happened to me, but something I saw. We lived on the corner of the street, and the house across the street on our right was also a corner house. Well, one day, that house caught on fire because the lady living there decided it was a great idea to fall asleep with a candle on a wicker table next to curtains. It was really bad. We saw the lady jump out the second-story window and made it across the street. Well, she left her children in the house. One by one, they jumped out the second-story window. 3 tiny little children. My eldest brother ran across the street each time and brought them back. Once the firefighters put out the fire, they went inside the window to check out the house. The firefighter came out carrying a dead, burned-up child. He had his arms up, as if he was pounding on a door. That was the most horrifying thing I have ever seen. Let's get to the next story. Was in a car accident, was not driving, and suffered a traumatic brain injury. I was wearing a seatbelt. Basically, the whiplash of the force from the cars caused my brain to hit my skull, which caused my brain to start bleeding. I was in a medically induced coma for like 3 days and had to learn how to talk, walk again. Doctor said I couldn't be an engineer. I'm 28 now, and am a design engineer at a high-end lighting firm and studying to be an aerodynamics engineer. Don't let anything stop you. Next story. Getting roofied. If somebody hadn't called me a cab, God knows what could have happened. I remember falling down and hitting my head on the pavement at least 3 times. I've never had such little control of my body. I woke up 14 hours later in my room with a bloodied face, scratches on my forehead. I had been out alone and given a glass of champagne by a stranger. It was like being teleported from 3 a.m. to 5 p.m. I am a male, anyone can be roofied, never accept drinks from strangers. Hey, thanks for subscribing and liking, it really means a lot to me. While you are here, feel free to hop on over to the last video. See you there. Ronnie.